played truth or dare at a house party and went too far, his face when I got home said everything. The truth is something that we all struggle with, and a lot of us try to hide as much truth as possible. But the reality of life is that the truth comes out one way or the other. It cannot be hidden for long. And my truth came out in the worst way possible. It was careless. Some might even call it stupid. I mean, when serious and life-changing secrets are revealed, it always involves some dramatic and overwhelming event that makes everyone feel the weight of what is being revealed. But the way my secret came out, it was almost too easy to believe, and it was so casual, but the secret was so great that it broke everything in my life. My name is Julia, and I'm a 27-year-old botanist who was married to the best man that ever walked the face of the earth, Brad. Brad wasn't your regular man. He had all the good parts you wanted from a man, and almost none of the bad. He was handsome, and I'm not talking about regular handsome. I mean, he's the type of guy that would walk past a row of women at a football game, and they would all turn to look at him. He was beautiful and tall and as charming as the morning sun. And my goodness, he was kind, but strong. Loving, but firm. He would defend me anytime, anywhere, and I was confident in his ability to do whatever I needed him to do. Brad loved me just as much as I loved him, and he showed it at every chance he got. When he met me, my parents were on my neck about my choice of career. They wanted me to do something more professional, like being a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer, something of that sort. They saw being a botanist as a job, but when I met Brad, he believed in me. He saw what even I couldn't see, and with his help, I opened my very own flower shop. It was difficult in the beginning, but I soon got a hang of it. And if I'm being honest, my business only survived because of Brad. He was the one that made his coworkers buy flowers for their desks from me. He steadily convinced them to buy flowers for their girlfriends and wives, and whenever any of them were getting married, he made sure that I was the one that supplied the flowers for the wedding. He took my dream and made it a reality. He was the one who showed my parents how successful I could be in the business I was doing. And it was only after he showed them how much money I was making that they began taking me seriously. He would constantly send them pictures of the events I decorated with flowers of the ones I supplied flowers for. The bigger the event, the better, and my parents got off my back. Like I said, he was everything to me. He was the very bedrock of my life. But I guess humans really are flawed. Because even with everything Brad did for me, I still couldn't get over the little he didn't do. Brad didn't like getting in the kitchen and couldn't cook to save his life. He would do anything, absolutely anything and everything, but he would not and could not cook. Whenever I tried to teach him, he'd tell me he had other things to do, and truly, he did have a lot on his plate. He was just promoted, and he was shouldering a lot of responsibilities. He was very busy, and I knew this, but whenever I called, he answered the call immediately. Whenever I needed him, he'd come running with immediate effect. At some point, he needed to start working late hours and even staying at work overnight, and that caused a serious strain in our lives because I couldn't sleep alone at night. Yes, I'm scared of the dark, and I don't like being alone, especially at night. That was practically the beginning of all our problems. I was unhappy when he told me that he wouldn't be as available at home as usual, and I begged him to try and come back home every night. But he told me that he couldn't make that promise. I was unhappy, but I had to face reality, and since I couldn't stay home alone, I decided to go stay with my parents. They stayed in the city as well. My mother teased and laughed at me about how I was an adult who was still too scared to be alone in the dark, but I didn't mind. I could go to my flower shop from my parents' house. Besides, I needed to be in my parents' house for only a week. The only downside was that I had to share a room with my younger brother, who was the most disorganized person I knew. But I kept telling myself that it was just for a few days, a week at most. But those few days were going to change my life, as I knew it. A day after I went back to my parents' house, I woke up in the morning to the smell of something delicious coming from the kitchen. I love food. I always said that there are 3 things I love the most: Brad, flowers, and food. I got up from the bed and went to the kitchen to see what was going on, and I met a literal surprise. I met Charles. He was average in height, but his sense of humor was through the roof. I asked him who he was because I had never seen such a human in my life, ever. And here he was, in my mother's kitchen. He looked at me like I was the intruder and asked me the same question. While we were both interrogating each other without any answers being given, my father walked in and asked what was going on. I told him that there was a stranger in the kitchen, and my father laughed and introduced Charles to me. He was the chef that handled things in the kitchen for my parents since they didn't have the will or strength to do stuff like that anymore. I settled into a chair, but with the way things started out for me and Charles, the air between us was still tense. I ate the meal he prepared that morning before going to work. My husband called me while I was at work, just to talk to me. He missed me, and he was calling to let me know just how much he missed me. He couldn't talk for long because he had to get back to work. So the call soon ended. When I got home early that evening, dinner was ready, and of course, it was prepared by Charles. When I got in, I saw him setting the dining table. He greeted me, and I replied to him, but not with much enthusiasm. I first went to freshen up and change into more comfortable clothes before I came back to the dining room. My parents were already seated. I joined them, and when the food touched my tongue, I couldn't believe it. It was like I was walking on clouds. It was so delicious, and when I reacted with verbal expressions, everyone laughed at me. For the next few days, I saw Charles in the morning when leaving for work, and in the evening when I came back from work, and I began warming up to him slowly. Weekend came, and I was so happy to go back home, but while I was packing up, I got a call from Brad telling me that he wouldn't be coming home that weekend either. He asked me for one more week. I didn't like that. He promised me that he would be back after just 1 week. I could feel that he really wanted to come home, but he clearly couldn't. I was sad, and I told him he was going to make it up to me. He told me he'd definitely make it up to me, that he'd give me anything I wanted. I agreed and began unpacking all my things. My younger brother was unhappy when he heard that I wasn't leaving anymore. He wanted his privacy back, and I wish I was like him. Valuing privacy meant the ability to be alone. I had none of that. The next morning, I wasn't feeling too well, so I didn't go to work. I went into the kitchen to get some coffee, and I met Charles there. He knew immediately I stepped into the kitchen that something was wrong with me. He asked me to take a seat and gave me the coffee himself. My parents came to grab breakfast and left. My brother left for work as well. It was just Charles and I in the house. I was worried that he would leave the house, but I couldn't exactly ask him that. So I just decided that if he was leaving the house, I'd go out as well, and only come back when I knew my parents would be back home. I really didn't feel like working that day, so I just went along with what my body needed, which was a break from work. Charles and I got talking, and he said he wanted to ask me something. I told him to go ahead, and he asked if it was true that I was scared of being alone. I was embarrassed, and I asked where he heard that. He said he heard my parents talking about it the day I came over. They couldn't believe I was still scared of the dark and scared of being alone. He said he couldn't believe it either. I covered my face in shame and confessed that it was true. Before I could read the room, he gently held my hands and carefully pulled them away from my face and told me that I didn't need to be ashamed. Without blinking, Charles told me that everyone was afraid of something, so I didn't need to feel bad about mine. I felt so seen and understood, and I even smiled when he said it. I thanked him and went back into my brother's room. While I was there, checking out the pictures of some rare flowers on the internet, I heard a knock on the door. I knew it was Charles, and I asked him to come in. He came in with a glass of juice on a tray and offered it to me. He said it would help with my mood and even my health. I thanked him, and he was about to leave, but I asked him to stay and tell me about himself. I was curious. He sat on the bed and began talking. He was an interesting person and had lived an interesting life. It was an honest surprise that he was cooking for my parents. We talked for hours, and my goodness, he was funny. I couldn't stop laughing throughout the time we were talking. After our long talk, he told me that he needed to start preparing dinner. I asked if I could help, and he was more than welcoming. He agreed, and I went along with him to the kitchen. I watched him cook and only intervened when he asked for something. It felt nice having someone to cook for you because I understood how hectic that could be. I was with him in the kitchen until dinner was ready and stayed with him until my parents came home. He served the table and left for the day. While I was in bed that night, I couldn't get our conversations off my mind. Charles was the funniest person I had ever talked to in my entire life, and he was just as interesting. I kept thinking about him and smiling, and when my brother came back late that night and saw me smiling, he asked if my husband had sent me a gift. That was when I realized that I hadn't spoken to my husband all day, and I wasn't even bothered about it. I told myself that he would most likely be working, so I didn't need to disturb him. Maybe that was it, but deep down, I knew that I just wanted the memories I had with Charles to burn deep into my skull and occupy my thoughts. Those memories helped me sleep well at night, and I didn't want anything to interrupt them. The next morning, I woke up late. Everyone had left the house before I got up, and I was honestly shocked at how deep I slept. I'd normally wake up whenever my brother was preparing to go to work. I brushed my teeth and went to the kitchen, where I saw Charles. He was as happy to see me as I was to see him. He asked if I wasn't going to work that day. I paused for a second. I hadn't thought about that. I was supposed to go to work, but when I opened my mouth, what I said was no. I don't know why I said that. Flowers were the second thing I loved the most. I enjoyed doing my job. But there I was, in my parents' kitchen, with a man I just met over a week ago, and I was skipping work. Charles made a comment about how it was nice to have some company. He served me breakfast, and while I ate, I asked him if he was always there in the house after everyone left. He was hesitant, but he coughed it up, telling me that he usually leaves to go do some other things and only comes back early enough to prepare dinner, although sometimes he sticks around. While we were talking, he loosened his hair, which had been tied backwards. He had long hair, and that was the first time I saw it loose. He was even more handsome with his hair down, and I didn't know when I muttered that he was beautiful. He smiled at me and told me that it meant a lot coming from me because I was very beautiful as well. I blushed and looked away. By the time I tried looking at him again, he was right next to me. He looked into my eyes and said he was just noticing that my eyes were turquoise, not blue. He told me that my eyes were rare. As he spoke, he was just in awe of my eyes. But my heart felt like it had stopped beating for a few seconds and was now beating harder than ever. He was dangerously close, and my breath had stopped as a result of anxiety. He was still looking me in the eyes, and when he snapped out of the amazement of my eyes, that was when he realized just how close he was. Our faces were barely inches apart. It was like we were being drawn to each other. But I suddenly cleared my throat and said that I needed to go check out some things on my computer. I managed to break off the tension that was brewing between us, and I quickly went back to my room. I suddenly felt hot, so I went into the bathroom to take a shower. I was done in under 10 minutes, and when I came out of the bathroom, I began applying my body cream. I was still in a towel when there was a soft knock on the door that was followed by the door opening. It was Charles. He didn't wait for me to answer after he knocked, and because of how he opened the door, I was startled. My towel suddenly slipped and exposed my nudity. Charles looked starstruck. He couldn't move, blink, or even say anything. It was like he was lost in me. I quickly grabbed my towel and covered myself properly. All that left Charles's mouth was that he would come back later. He left, closing the door after him. I quickly put on a gown and hurried out to the kitchen, where I confronted Charles. I scolded him, asking why he didn't wait for me to answer before he opened the door. He apologized to me, saying that he didn't know what he was thinking. He said he did not know that I wasn't wearing clothes when he came into the room. After his apology, he added that I had a beautiful body. I paused when I heard that. I didn't know if I was supposed to be mad or flattered, but I was flattered, and I thanked him. He took a step closer to me and said that he couldn't get my body off his mind. I told him that he should stop thinking of me in such a sensual manner, because I was a married woman. He closed in on me, sniffed my neck, and told me that I smelled nice. I couldn't move, and I don't know why till this day. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me that he didn't know. He said he was just going with what he felt, and even told me that he knew I felt it too, and he wasn't lying. I felt every bit of what he was feeling. My entire body was tingling with desire. And before I knew it, he pushed off the sleeves of my gown, and it literally dropped off my body. Things got very intense between us, and we had a very passionate, intimate moment. And it didn't just happen once that day, it happened again and again. That was basically what we spent the entire day doing. We only stopped because he needed to prepare dinner and my parents were coming home soon. For the rest of the week, I didn't go to work. I'd spend the entire day at home with Charles, and he'd make me feel like a woman. I enjoyed every single moment with him, and by the time the week was over, I was hoping that my husband would call and tell me that he wouldn't be able to come back home, but he was parked in front of my parents' house that Saturday morning. I was so shocked to see him and very disappointed, but I had to mask that disappointment and wear a stupid smile. I rushed into his arms and told him how much I missed him. I lied. I had barely thought about him in the past week. My husband took me home, and I didn't even get to say a proper goodbye to Charles. I didn't have his number. That was it. When we got home, Brad whipped out some things he bought for me. These were things I would normally be so excited to have, and I was excited to have them, but I just missed the feeling of being with Charles. Still, I had to pretend to be very happy. like the gifts were the best things that had happened to me in all the weeks I hadn't seen my husband. Brad was determined to make it up to me for being absent for 2 whole weeks. He had the week off and was determined to spend every bit of it with me. He drove me to work and even hung out with me at work, helping me sell flowers. And when work was over, he took me to a restaurant for us to enjoy ourselves. He was pulling out all the big guns to make up for lost time. One day while we were at the shop, he noticed that I was lost in thought, and he thought I was being worried, when in truth I was thinking about how Charles felt. I missed Charles, and I wanted more of him. In trying to cheer me up, Brad proposed that we should have a game night. The idea sounded absurd to me, and I laughed when he said it. I told him that he had never hosted a game night. Every single time we've had game night, it was one of our friends that hosted it. I always wanted us to host it, but we just never did. And now, Brad was serious about hosting. We both laughed when I told him that he was a horrible game planner, and he confirmed that I was right. He started calling all our friends and telling them that we should have a game night. One of our friends said he'd host and gave us a time. We were all there by that time. It was almost impossible to wrap my head around how quickly it all came together. When I walked into the living room, I saw Charles sitting there. I froze, unable to understand what he was doing there. I looked at my husband, who was oblivious to the fact that I knew Charles. I needed to keep it that way. I pretended like I didn't know Charles. And thankfully, Charles was smart enough to play along. Our friend who was hosting introduced Charles to everyone as a friend of his who came around. He asked if we all didn't mind that there was an extra player. No one objected. In fact, they were all happy to have an extra player. The games began and the night was very entertaining. We played every game that could be played on game night. And what made it even more dramatic was that I sat between my husband and Charles. I tried my best to pretend like I didn't know him, but what was even harder was me trying to hold back as though the man I had been craving was not right beside me. I wasn't very good at playing games, so I drank a lot because I failed a lot. Then came the crazy one, truth or dare. I didn't like dares, and I was lucky that I kept picking cards with truth questions on them. I preferred truths. The game kept going smoothly, and at one point, I was asked the last time I was intimate. I told them I couldn't remember. The game went round again, then I was asked what the craziest thing I had done was. I laughed and said it was being intimate while cooking. I could see the naughty smirk on Charles's face from the side of my eyes when I said that. The next one was a dare. I dared to kiss someone that wasn't my spouse. I didn't drink or even overthink it. I just looked at Charles and smiled, like the world just gave me the luckiest raffle tickets. I grabbed him and kissed him. And I'm not talking about any mild 2-second kiss. It was long, intense, and the most passionate thing I had felt since Brad came home. After what felt like an eternity of pleasure, Charles and I stopped kissing. No one could believe it. The shock on the faces of each of our friends was overwhelming, but the game went on. I looked at my husband's face, and it was pure shock. It was clear he was beyond mad. Our friends tried to make sure nothing escalated by continuing the game, but that didn't subdue my husband's rage. He sprang up from where he was sitting and shouted that they should stop the game. I asked him what was wrong, and he looked at me like I was some heathen who had committed the worst sin. He asked me if I had lost my mind. I told him he was acting out of character, and he grabbed a bottle and threw it at the wall. He asked me not to dare speak of him of character when I was the one who buried my tongue in another man's mouth. Charles tried to calm him down by saying that we were all just playing a game. Brad furiously tried to attack Charles, but our friends held him back and pleaded with him to calm down. Brad's eyes were burning with rage, but Charles wouldn't shut up. Charles suddenly said that it wasn't his fault that he was a good kisser. Brad lunged forward and threw a punch that pushed Charles back. Our friends caught him again and pulled him back. They pleaded with him to calm down, and he suddenly announced that the game was over and told me to get up so we'd leave. Brad walked to the door before I could even get up. I looked at Charles and he smiled at me with the naughtiest smile I had ever seen. It made me blush before I hurried to go meet my husband. After we got home, just as I was about to take off my shoe, Brad stood in front of me and asked me who Charles was to me. My heart skipped a beat in fear. And before I could answer that, he asked that in all the years he and I had been married, where and when the two of us were intimate in the kitchen while cooking. That had never happened between my husband and I. The only time I had ever experienced something sensual in the kitchen was with Charles. I tensed up. I could have easily said that I lied to look cool, but my brain was processing things too slowly that night. I didn't say anything. He then asked me if I had cheated on him. I was still speechless. When I finally found my words, I told him that I didn't, that he was being dramatic. He shouted at me, saying that he knew something was wrong. I just kissed a stranger like if I had a chance, I would have gotten on the floor there with him and gone loose. He said that I must have known Charles from somewhere else, because I kept smiling at Charles and Charles kept smiling at me. I was shocked. My husband noticed all of it. He also added that I had been absent-minded whenever we were together since he got back. He asked me to be truthful with him. I told him that I didn't. He called me a liar. He said he knew that something was going on between me and Charles. He said he could feel it. He paced around the living room restlessly and angrily. Next thing I knew, he left the house. I was so scared that night, and I don't know if it was because of the alcohol, but everything felt a lot worse. I put on all the lights in the house, but that didn't stop the fact that I was alone in the house. I curled up in a blanket, scared, and cried throughout the night, and when Brad came back very early in the morning. He was bruised and injured and drunk. I was so worried about him, but when I tried to check on him and asked him what happened, he pushed my hands off. He walked to the bathroom to go take a bath. I later learned that my husband had gone back to the place where we had the game night. He confronted Charles and things got intense. Charles bragged about how he made me feel loved and they exchanged fists. Charles apparently told Brad that if he was more present in my life and satisfied me more often, then I wouldn't have cheated. I wanted the earth to swallow me. Brad didn't speak to me after he came back, and he still hasn't. It's been weeks. I'm scared this is the end for us. Update. It's been about 2 months after that truth or dare night. My husband hasn't talked to me since then. He sleeps in the living room and refuses to even eat the food I cooked. He lives like he's living with a stranger who could kill him at any time. I tried pleading with him several times, but he would not take whatever I was saying. Whenever I tried talking to him, he would just put on headphones or he'd walk away. He stayed out more often, and every time he went out, I was scared he wouldn't come back home. I was scared that he would abandon me. One day I pleaded with him, and he angrily went into the bathroom to take his bath. When he came out of the bathroom, I was there pleading with him. He didn't say a word. He just got dressed, went to the car, and drove off. I was so scared that he wouldn't come back that particular day because of how outraged he looked when he left. But he came back at night. I was thinking he was worried about me being alone at night, but I was wrong. He simply grabbed some clothes and left. I tried asking him where he was going, but he didn't answer me. I slept alone that night, as I have been for some nights. I had a lot of nightmares, but I didn't want to go anywhere because that was exactly how I cheated in the first place. Slowly, my life began to decay. Brad was at home a lot less, and our friends all knew what happened, so most of them stayed away from me. His entire office stopped buying flowers from me, and before I knew it, Brad came home one evening and handed me 2 documents. One was divorce papers, and the other was a document basically asking me to pay rent to him or move out. I couldn't believe it. But what was even more jarring was the price he wanted me to pay for rent. Yeah, the house we lived in belonged to him, and there was no way I could afford that rent. He was just being inconsiderate and cruel, and I knew I deserved it. So he threw me out. Now, my business is dying, and my marriage is practically dead. I don't know where to go from here. Brad has abandoned me and moved on, but I don't know how to. I can't even visit my parents anymore because they are ashamed of me. I cheated on my husband in their house. I am the black sheep of the family, and it is humiliating. I don't see any redemption for me. My life is over. I had to pack my things to my flower shop because I had nowhere to go. I am lost and confused, and my life is in absolute shambles.